Yeah.
Everybody has Gilgamesh, right?
I do not. I forgot it.
Well, you read it.
I read it, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Same with you too.
How did that happen? Can you guys talk about how that happened, and I'll be right back? Just like discuss it with each other, and then come up with a consensus about why that happened, and then we'll talk. Okay? Back in a minute.
It's an AM class and I'm an idiot. So.
I just completely forgot.
It's really early in the morning.
I just don't care.
Should we go for anything?
Sorry if that detracts from the discussion, but I was consuming.
Is this an edition?
Well, it might be translated.
I had to
Oh,
cancel
yeah,
my
it's
order on
okay.
Amazon because it wasn't coming fast enough, so I just
Oh.
went to the library. That's the only one they had.
I'm sure it'll be similar. Just check. It might be like if it's like Amazon.
It's actually really different.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure like the
No,
meaning's the same, but the words are like super different.
Yeah, but it's still telling the same story for the most part.
Yeah, exactly.
Just kidding.
This one is a lot easier to get through too.
Okay, so we won't do this again, but this one time I want to know what happened today with 3 people in a small class where we all knew what we were doing, not bringing the book to class. It's going to make it very hard to understand the class. So you guys discussed it, so I need a spokesperson to explain that.
Human error.
So you just forgot. Okay, it won't happen again, right? It won't happen again? Okay. All right, good. I think we're all ready to plunge in, I think, this time. But the one thing that I want to do is finish any last little touches on Inanna. Because we hadn't completely finished that. Of course, you never completely, that's the wrong phrase to use, because there's no way at any point you could completely finish anything so complex as an myth for an entire culture that was so important for so many thousands of years. So I'm not expecting this to be finished. That's why I'm assigning essays, because and you'll know an essay is due in the next class on the very material that we've been discussing. And it's up to you to go a step deeper, or to go to places that we haven't already discussed, as well as to show, or alternatively to show, or both, that you understand what we've been talking about. So even if you summarize some points we've already made, that's okay. It's a very short paper, and it's my way of finding out how well you've been understanding and keeping up with the material. Okay, so why does Inanna want to go to the underworld? This is a good place just to pick up and review a little before moving on to the next text, which is part of the same fabric in some ways as this text is. As you know, these are both Near Eastern texts, and we're only going to do this once with the Near East. After the next class, this class and a little of the next class, we're finished with that. By the way, every class in the course, they all lock together. You'll see that we're never completely finished, because the very thing that we're discussing now, will lead into the discussion of Gilgamesh, which will lead into the discussion of the flood, which will lead into the discussion of Noah, and so forth, in the Bible. And everything locks together very, very elegantly. But, so even then, but we won't be moving back to the Near East after this in the course. So this is all to give you some exposure and then move on. But why does she choose to go to the underworld? After all, she was doing really well. And we might have touched on this, but I was curious what you thought. You understand why this is really important. And you understand maybe that even at the time that people are singing this song, they don't necessarily know what's going to happen. You could know the story of the Odyssey and not know what's going to happen to Odysseus. You could know the story of Adam and Eve in the old days and not know exactly what's going to happen. You say, how could that be? Because it was in the oral culture for a long time before it got written down. Thank you, Desiree. You could pull up a chair, Desiree. Let's all be up at the table because we're a small class. So understand also that if this text is as important as I'm saying it is, it speaks to something very deep about the human condition that's still relevant today. That when we read existential works, we're going to be reading discussing the same human condition that we're dealing with here in one of the oldest texts of human history. It's the same question. Why would somebody choose to go down to the underworld when she's got everything going for her in the upper world? Go ahead, yes. Josh, go ahead.
She still feels like she wants power over death, because she already has power over life. So she wants the power of death to be combined with her power.
See, that's an interesting answer. Do you think that once we have power over life, the next step that we want is power over death? Where's there evidence that that theme is not unique to Inanna and her story? Go ahead.
The quest for immortality?
And where do we see that elsewhere?
In so many
Kayla.
stories and fables.
And for example?
Like the Fountain of Everlasting Youth.
Okay, there's the whole fairy tale of the Fountain of Youth, but do we have to go to Grimm's fairy tale to get that story? What else have you read for today?
Gilgamesh.
And what's that all about?
He wants to
Fighting death.
He wants to fight death.
Yeah.
So I'm saying right away, that same theme is coming back. So it seems very plausible to me that what Josh is saying is a good answer. By the way, when I ask a question, it's not like I have one answer that I'm looking for. I'm curious what you think. I've thought a lot about these books. I mean, I have a lot of ideas, but I'm curious what you think. Go ahead, yes, Salim.
Well, for me, there was a multifaceted reason why she decided to go down to the underworld. I think the first one that's obvious is that she felt forsaken by her lover and wanted to get back at him in some way, maybe perhaps causing death to occur to him. So in order to do that, she has to conquer the realm of death in order to inflict that on him. And then looking deeper into it, I also thought that perhaps she was upset about marrying him because her family wanted her to marry him, and in doing so kind of wanted to prove to them that they were wrong in asking her to marry the shepherd instead of the farmer, and kind of plotting for his demise or for the relationship not to work.
Okay, so a twofold answer, but the first thing you said is that she wants to get her husband out of his comfort zone. After all, she's used to being a turbulent force, and he's kind of complacent with his kingship. So it seems plausible, at least, that she can play a role in his development, just as, her sister, Death, is playing a role in her own development. Some people see her sister as a version of herself and her as a version of her husband, so maybe we have different sides of ourselves that we're also confronting. But I like your answer.
I thought just more
the other
a
part,
role
though,
in-
going back to her girlhood, I don't know if she still has a gripe about that, because she was, 13 years old when she had that. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know how you see it, but at least in my view, she's much older at this point when she descends to the underworld. She's much more evolved. She's already been queen of heaven.
Well, sometimes as adults you can blame your parents for decisions that you made as a kid. So
No.
I can see it being plausible.
Look, there's nothing in the text that explains it, so it's for us to come up with some kind of explanation. And then what's the problem with trying to achieve a dominance over death?
You have to die. You
have to die.
in order to do that.
And if you die in order to conquer death, then have you conquered it, or has it conquered you?
Just it's a circle.
Right, so it's a problem. To get some things, we have to give some things up, right? You know this is true of everything in life? Like, to be grown up, then you can't be young anymore, and then, to be, in a higher paying job, you have to give up your free time, or whatever you want, you gotta give something up, And then the hardest part of power might be actually the power of not having to have what you have, because that's a weakness too. You know, we could say, you know, having a nice pair of shoes is a strength, but, you know, the more shoes you wear, the weaker your feet get. It means you can't walk without your shoes now. So, you know, somebody who's never had shoes has got an advantage over someone who's worn shoes her whole life or his whole life, right? So maybe in order to walk better, you have to give up your shoes, but then actually that impedes your ability to walk because you're so dependent on what you already have. So giving things up is the only way of attaining a kind of new power, but it requires that you relinquish power, and then it's a bit of a paradox, right? To give up your life in order to attain the power of death means that you don't attain power, you give it up. And yet it could also be a kind of power to give things up. To be powerless is a kind of power. People who can't deal with powerlessness are not as powerful in some way as people who are. So it's very, very paradoxical and complex. But this is a common motif, right? We've seen it in the Persephone myth. We've seen it elsewhere. You know, this journey to the underworld theme, we're going to see it in Gilgamesh. We see it in the Bible. We see it in the Odyssey. It's everywhere, in some form or another. And her relation to Ereshkigal, you'll remember that's her older sister. So, you know, and she already knows this is going to be bad. We talked about that, right? That she warns, you know, her vizier, you know, if something happens to me, this is what you do. And then she has to give up all her adornments. I mean, it's all a form of relinquishment of power in order to attain a power over a realm or understanding of a realm that can only be understood by relinquishing understanding, and so forth and so on. But once she's laid everything aside, she becomes, what does she become? I mean, at the very lowest zone that we looked at her very weakest point.
Just her body.
Right. But what is her body when she's hanging on a hook? What is that? What is that an allegory for, or an etiology of? Which again, we're reading this in a psychological way about life passages, the midlife crisis. You can view it in all those ways. But when you start to see her as like a piece of meat, well, what does she represent now? And the word used in the text is meat, right? So what angle do you have to apply? Because I gave you all those lenses, you know, weeks ago about how to read these texts from many angles.
Maybe an old crone?
Well, the old crone thing still suggests a Jungian maid mother crone structure. That's still psychological. But meat is what? We can go back to where she's a piece of meat on a hook. Where would you see that? I mean, in your own experience.
Dead?
A rotting
corpse?
piece of meat. Where do you see rotting pieces of meat?
A butcher.
At a butcher shop, which would mean that she's food.
Yeah.
But she's already associated with food, isn't she? She's the beer harvest, right? She's the grape harvest. Why can't she also be the food that you stored for the winter that's now getting kind of rotten because she's been down there a while? In other words, it's that point in the season where the food has gone bad. Seems perfectly plausible that in an allegorical way or an etiological way, this is an explanation for why it's hard. I don't know if you've gone to the Union Square Green Market lately, but they don't have all the fruits and vegetables available right now. They have old onions, and they have some meat that, you know, is left over from whatever they've stored, but they don't really have a lot of new food coming out at this time of year. Locally, I mean, you forget this because they flow bad tomatoes and like tasteless watermelons in from other parts of the country. But you know that stuff's not in season. It wouldn't normally be available. That's why it doesn't taste good. But, you know, in the middle of winter, you could have a period of famine. And so this is the most famished point in her life, and she, in fact, is an embodiment of that. Could remind you again of Demeter depriving people of food, starving them at some point, though she is like the starvation in and of itself here. Anyway, you know, she does get rescued by Enki. And it's interesting, you remember that that's the guy that she got the powers from, you know, that made her so powerful, you know, way back when. He creates those spirits, the Kungara, you know, the Galator. These are androgynous creatures that Ereshkigal can't really fight with. There's another version where they send this very good-looking spirit down there, and Ereshkigal's attracted to him, and that's how, you know, the release of Inanna is orchestrated. But you know, whatever they are, they're impervious to Ereshkigal's power. She becomes angry, but she is ordered she orders Namtar to sprinkle the water of life on Inanna. And what is that always whenever you see water? Someone getting sprinkled. What's that?
It's like rebirths. There's like 5 different meanings of water.
Yeah, but it's fertility and it's rebirth, and I think you're right, Holly. There's no way around like water being. But you know, if you take an old plant, you know, and you go away for a vacation, you come back. What happens? What's happened to your plant on the windowsill?
It's drooping over.
It's all drooping, and you add more water, and it perks back up, right? Well, that's So water is a symbol of regeneration. That's nothing new. And then, she starts picking up all her adornments again, and she recovers. But of course, what's the catch? Do we just go back to life the way it was, or is there a catch? I mean, this is an important theme we haven't talked about. Go on. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
She has to give someone in return.
Okay, so Vrushti says she has to give somebody a new turn. Like, but it's your turn, we think of that as a good thing. Like, but it could be a bad thing. Like, it's your turn now. Like, I just dove off that diving board into the ocean, now you have to do it. Right? Someone else has to take her place, right? Yeah. So what seems to be the similarity here between this and the Persephone myth? Because I said all these units that we're reading lock together, that they're arranged in the order they are for a reason. What do we learn from the Persephone myth? Yeah,
It's
go
like,
ahead,
it's
Holly.
like a bargain of how long Persephone's down in the underworld, like 2/3 up top, 1/3 on the bottom. So
Right.
it's just like making a deal.
Once you've been down there, can you ever come completely back? No, because your place in the underworld has to be occupied. It's like, once you leave it vacant, it's not like it was before you ever got there. It's like a debt you owe. So that place in the underworld can't be left vacant. And when things are done one way, they can never be reversed in myth. Once something's established, like Persephone is the queen of the underworld, she can't become anything else. That is her mythic role. And yes, she still spends 2/3 of her life upstairs, but we still remember her as the queen of the underworld. We still call Hades, we'll see this in the Odyssey, Persephone's land. And the same is true for Inanna. Once she's been down there, she has like a rental down there, and she still has to pay that rent. And to maintain the place, she needs someone to replace her. Now you remember in the hymn to Demeter, it was 2/3, 1/3. That's the way the seasons work in ancient Athens and in Eleusis outside Athens, where those rituals were practiced. Here in the Middle East, in what would be modern day Iraq, the season is 50-50. So it's kind of like a warm half of the year and a cold half, and that's why she's got this 50-50 deal. And then, who does she choose to replace her? Because this is something that Salim was referring to. Because you have to, once you've been down there, that underworld can't be left completely vacant. You need either to go back yourself or to replace yourself. So go ahead, yeah.
She chose Dumuzi to take her place?
No, did she have to choose Dumuzi?
She didn't have to, no.
So why did she choose her own husband? Why not someone who's less important to her?
Because he wasn't paying his respects to her, he wasn't mourning her.
So he wasn't mourning her, he was kind of happy with his life. He didn't even notice she was gone. This is highly symbolic. I doubt that would really be happening in a marriage where people love each other. But on a symbolic level, you could be living with someone who doesn't really empathize with you the way that person should, or whatever you can read it however you want. She seen it as actually good for him to have to go down and experience death. Go ahead, yes.
Also, she becomes more powerful than God.
Oh, well, that's an interesting read. Maybe this is her chance to have it all. I mean, we thought she was, the queen of heaven and earth, but now she's the queen of heaven and earth with no king to compete with, which is an interesting way of looking at it. I like Krishti's answer. And lots of ways to read these things. The text does not fill in the interpretive part. It's for us to interpret it. It gives the structure. Same is true of the Bible, which we're going to get to in the next class. From a etiological perspective, though, why do you have to, to pay for marriage with death? Why do we have an association of sex and death? Like Freud would say they're intimately linked. That's a psychological reading already, though. How about etiologically? What's the connection between death and life if you're just talking about plants?
Plants die.
And
they can grow, and you can keep them alive longer if you like take care of them.
and how do you take care of them?
You water them.
Do they just need water? Nothing else?
They need sun.
Fertilizer.
Water,
just
but what's
stuff,
fertilizer?
Dead stuff.
Okay, so Ella's saying, wait a minute, fertilizer is dead matter. It's like, you take the plants that you're composting and you make that into soil. Death is what fertilizes life. Life cannot be without feeding on death. I don't know if you've noticed that all the food you eat is dead life. I don't know if you noticed that. And you could say, oh, like maybe you're a vegan, maybe you don't eat any animal food, but you're eating dead plants. You know, in the original Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve don't even kill plants. But they're still eating something. We'll get to that a little later. But as time goes on, people start eating more and more things, plants and then animals. And you can't live without eating dead life. There's no form of life that can. So we understand, as the ancient Sumerians understood, the ancient Sumerians have an intimate connection between life and death. Of course, you may notice that time of year when animals mate, they often die right after that. You forget about this when you're human, but insects, in the late fall where all those cicadas, those big buzzy bugs, they call them June bugs sometimes, they don't live past August. They mate and then they drop dead. And all their shells are lying all over. It was very easy to observe if you're watching the cycle of nature. Things like praying mantises, black widow spiders, they mate and they actually eat their own mates. I mean, it's kind of disgusting, but it actually relates to what's going on here. As soon as we're ready to have fertility, we have to kill her own mate, Anyway, and then we do get a new season, But the seasons of life and death are also symbolized literally by food here, right? Because when she, if you think of it this way, there's another level because there's a whole social theme going on here too. But when her brother goes down, when her husband goes down there, is that the end for him?
No.
So what's the deal that he then makes? Yeah, go ahead.
His sister takes the place of his for half the year.
Okay, so Geshtanana, his sister, takes his place, and she's the grape harvest. So again, we're talking about different crops and their different times. We got the beer harvest, and the date harvest symbolized by Inanna and Dumuzi, but now we also have the grape harvest symbolized by the sister of Dumuzi. So there are all these different levels. And if you remember, it's the sisters and the mother of Dumuzi that come to the rescue here and then involve his own sister on his behalf to take his place. So there's a big theme about the social role of women in this society, I think, also. So you could read it sociologically, you could read it psychologically, you could read it etiologically, and these are all methods that we've discussed with other myths, but it's applicable here to apply all these lenses. Could you even get a ritualist reading? In what way could ritual be involved? And you remember too, like when, like the mother of the sister of Dumuzi is down there, she mourns her lost son. Like if I go to page 67 here, she's, I'm just picking a random moment here. I will go to him, I would see his face. Oh, treacherous step, where is my child? So the mother of Dumuzi goes through her own Demeter type mourning for her own son. That's a lot like, Demeter mourning for Persephone. There are lots of interlocking themes here. But this last section, starting on page 66, is the return. So the section before that was the descent of Inanna. In the last section, we get return and reintegration. As I said, this whole thing is divided into parts, as we discussed briefly last time. Any signs that this is also a ritual, that we could read this ritualistically? Any thoughts about, because that was another method we talked about. Yeah, go ahead, Salim.
When you mourn someone that dies, like a funeral or a wake or just visiting their grave, that could be something that is taken from this.
Oh, I meant in a bigger way, because that's true, and there are rituals of mourning, but I meant the whole cycle of Inanna, Dumuzi, Geshtanana, this whole cycle of people spending part of their time in the upper world and they're not people, they're gods, part of time in the underworld. This whole where does that become a kind of ritual and not just a story?
Maybe
Go
the
ahead.
planting and harvesting of crops.
Well,
So-
yeah, well, that's a kind of ritual, but it could also, by some people, be viewed as purely practical. But what are we told at the end here, page 69, for instance? So that the New Year's Day, the day of rites, may be properly determined. The first day of the month is closely examined. On the day of the disappearance of the moon, the me are perfectly carried out. Well, what does that mean, New Year's Day, the day of rites? What does rites mean? When the people of Sumer are assembled in the palace, in the house which guides the land. I'm just reading from the text here. What is the day of rites? What does that word rites mean?
Rituals?
Rituals. So we're told here that there's a New Year's ritual that is surrounding this whole myth that we've read, the entire thing. Like, for example, we have the birth of Christ celebrated in a holiday called Christmas, right? So a lot of people might read the story of Jesus and not be aware that it's a ritual. Think of the people coming to it 6,000 years from now and wondering, well, I know this is a strange perspective, but who was this Jesus God? You know, what was that story about? And you're saying, no, they practiced a whole ritual. People would buy presents for each other that time of year. Okay, well, this is like that. We're going back to something that they just assume you knew, that this was a big ritual. It was part of their culture. These are their gods. You know, the time of rebirth, coming back from the underworld, is a day of celebration, like celebrating the birth of Jesus or the birth of Persephone, who returns. Not the birth, the rebirth of Persephone, the resurrection when she comes back. So we've got a ritual reading at the beginning and the end of the agricultural year and the rites that grew out of that. So there's so much going on here. So let me sum up a bit, and then we'll move on to Gilgamesh. How does this myth as a whole inform the roles of, the main gods of this culture, Inanna, Ereshkigal, and the balance between them? Well, the thing you have to remember is that the queen in heaven and earth is what Inanna is. Yes, she's the god of fertility, sexuality, but ultimately she becomes the god of everything, heaven and earth. We think of that as everything, but there's a third realm. And people often forget about this. The underworld is beyond Inanna's control, and it's really the realm of her sister, who is in some way her opposite, but some people view the sister as part of her, like her dark side. So what we have here is in some way an explanation for death, for suffering, for basic questions that we all have to ask. These are existential questions that are not going away. That is the human condition. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Is there a bigger plan or a purpose to our existence? And there's a fundamental connection between fertility and the role of new life and death. I mean, these things are interlocking. Everyone who dies has to be replaced by someone living. Life comes out of death. This is fundamental to this, okay? So to sum up Inanna's role, she's the god of lady of myriad offices, And this can be traced to her fundamental traits. She's impetuous, she's celebratory, but she's also a little dangerous. She has an insatiable energy, okay? She manages the agricultural realm, but she also manages the social realm. She gives order and civilization to society. What a powerful god. She's sexually very open, very joyous, but she can also be dangerous. She's full of churning emotion, and she's associated with battle. Remember, the dance of Inanna is the dance of war. So she has all these aspects of herself. She's the life force herself. She's benign, but she's also quite threatening. So she's the queen of heaven. She's also the queen of earth. She's the queen of the high, the great above, and also the great below. The young and the old, the dead and the living. She incorporates all of this. Now, a psychologist would go a step deeper and say, well, yeah, but if you look at it, she is also us. So again, culturally, you could say, wow, a culture where, the greatest and most powerful god is female. I mean, we really have goddess worship here. And this is one of the myths that inspired many myth scholars to believe that cultures start with the worship of a powerful female deity before they start worshiping male deities. After all, the earth that you live on is female. It's closer to a woman than a man. And what if all the male gods come later, that ultimately the power, the original goddess, the original all-powerful god is always female? We're not even in question here because her sister Ereshkigal is already also female. Utu, the sky god, though he's supposed to be, or in some sense, a ruler, it plays almost no role in the story. With that in mind, it's fascinating from a cultural perspective. Could this be true of all major societies? Anywhere you go in the world. It doesn't matter if you go to Babylonia, Assyria, the Hebrew Bible, if you go to ancient India, if you go to Native American cultures. What if the original god is female? That's one theory I want you to think about, is one that is highly debated and controversial. As I might have mentioned, white buffalo woman, the Sioux god. It's a very masculine society, the Sioux. They're the ones that were accused of causing all the trouble and scalping people. And there might have been moments of that, but understand this is all very demeaning to say that they're just savages. I mean, the real savages are the people that surrounded their encampments and just killed them all in their sleep. The Western, colonists. But in any event, they're a very masculine culture. They're very warlike. But what if the white buffalo woman, which is Fig Roll and the Wolf, is their ultimately most powerful god if you go back? And that tells you something about them, that originally they worshipped a female god first and foremost. Now that's one way of looking at this from a cultural perspective, but from a psychological perspective, Mircea Eliade, whom we read an essay by in the first class, enumerates the stages of the ritual of descent, where he describes all of us as Inanna. So he sees Inanna's life cycle as your life cycle, as the life cycle of every human being. And he breaks that cycle down into certain steps. So he's got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps, which he calls the ritual of descent. And then there's Campbell and others who describe kind of a journey that everybody takes in life that has 4 steps. Let me break down the underworld descent, and then the 4 steps that Mircea Eliade gives. The first step is separation from the family. That there comes a point in your life where you just have to let go of your familiar relationships. And then there's step 2, regression to a prenatal state. He also calls this the cosmic night, where you go back into the deepest part of yourself and become like a preborn infant. And then he says the third step is death, which can also take the form of dismemberment or suffering. So that's the third step. And then the 4th step is rebirth. We see all of these in the Inanna cycle. And then the killing of someone else is the 5th step. So it doesn't all sound pretty, the killing of someone else. But if you view the ritual of descent, of going down and experiencing death as a positive thing, killing another person is giving that person something. Like in tarot cards, which represent ancient fertility rituals, death is always rebirth.
Right.
So you don't have to worry about getting a bad tarot card because it's a limited Western reading of it if you don't understand. But Josh knows about this, so that's cool. Okay, so what's the cause of her descent? From a psychological perspective, and where you're Inanna, someday you're going to grow up and be disillusioned or dissatisfied with your life, or you're going to want to separate from a loved one, or there's going to be some kind of call to a mission. This could be anything. This could be a woman in her 30s who in the 1950s decides she's sick of just being a housewife and wants to go out there and have a career. That could be a call. There could be a point in your life where you're a very successful lawyer and you decide you don't want to do this anymore.
So these are basic human experiences.
Right, you get this? This is the way a psychologist Eliade is actually kind of a spiritualist, but Campbell, Eliade, Jung, they all have this aspect of the way they read these myths that is deep psychological structures, what they're interested in. But do you believe in this thing called the midlife crisis? For Dante, it's called the dark woods of error. That there's a point in your life where people very often make a big shift, and doesn't tend to be like in their early 30s or something. It tends to happen like when they're in their 40s or 50s, like when they're older. Or maybe 60, it depends. But there's a point where an actor says, yeah, I am a famous actor, but I don't want to act anymore. I know that I'm wealthy, I'm famous, they're still giving me roles, but I want to give it up. And people are all surprised. How could you do that? You know, how could you, when you're so big, decide that you just want to give it up? He said, well, you know, it's really annoying, and it's like I'm not happy with it, and I can't have any deep satisfaction this way. Why do people do this? You're aware that people do this? They give up their jobs. They switch careers. They sometimes leave their spouses. They give up their wealth. They move to another country. It could be all these things at once sometimes, or any one of them. Why do people do things like that? If you work so hard to get where you are, why would you give all that up? Go ahead, yes.
Maybe because the individual has been doing that same thing for years, and they've been like working up to it, and they want to see what else is offered to them in this giant world.
Yeah. Like, what if you're like a tennis player, ballet dancer, something you've been doing that your whole life, and you don't know anything else? You wonder what's out there beyond this.
It's like kind of a Disney princess sort of thing.
Well, would you see it even in Disney? Disney's all cool because it's all myth-based, but they sanitize it because they're so afraid of anything dicey or anything scary, deeply dicey or scary. That's why I would be careful of Disney, because they take good myths, but they clean it up so much that they sometimes obscure the meaning. As I mentioned, their version of Heracles. Hercules is an illegitimate son of Zeus and Hera. In the movie by Disney, he's the legitimate child, which destroys the whole meaning of the thing, as far as I'm concerned. Go on, yes.
So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you look at that, then it's
Okay, good. Yeah.
it says that first you need like shelter and basic things, and then at one point you need money and love, and then once you pass that, all you want is enlightenment, basically. I mean, this self-actualization.
So you're saying deep self-satisfaction means
Yeah.
getting beyond, like, achieving acceptance by your community. So you're taking a class in psychology, or
No.
you've heard that?
I had to use this for an essay once.
Okay, great.
In high school.
Well, it's great when you can connect stuff that you've learned in another context, right? Go ahead, yes, Ella?
Like going back to the stages of life and departure from childhood,
Yeah.
if the place that the person's at in life is kind of just an extension of their childhood, their mom has been taking them to piano lessons since they were 5, and then they became like a concert pianist, and then at one point they had to depart from that childhood and grow up and figure out what it is they want to do for themselves.
Yeah, do you realize sometimes people are just doing it all to please the powers that be? There was a story on NPR recently about a physicist. I mean, he was actually really good at physics, so that's what he emphasized in college, and he went on to become very successful at it, but he never liked it. It's just where his talent was. And then one day he decides, I don't want to do it anymore. And it's a big, very disturbing, upsetting to everyone around him. It's like, why would you choose, it's like if your favorite, rock band breaks up or something. I'm trying to give you like a youth model for this. But they'd be that's like a younger midlife crisis if that's this, why would they choose that? I mean, they were so great together, but you're not, all you're seeing on the outside is their music. You're not seeing what's deeply going on in their lives, wow. Going all the way back to the first really popular rock group, why would the Beatles break up, Well, they want to go somewhere deeper, that it's not working to just please, the commercial expectations that are out there, and they're not deeply satisfied as individuals. And I don't know if this helps to bring in some pop example, but that's like old pop, so I don't think I'm being too hip about it. Inanna's so old, it's like, I'm comparing her to like someone who, is unhappy in his modern nuclear family marriage or something. But yeah, William James, the great American philosopher, psychologist, brother of Henry James, the great novelist, he said that when this moment came, he says, I'm quoting him, "A force impelled me to get rid of my existence one way or another." He doesn't know what this force was, but it wasn't suicide that he's talking about, but something much deeper and more vital. In a way, it's like therapy. He's but he's his own psychiatrist. This is before psychiatry. He's one of the founding figures of pragmatism and psychology. He's a psychologist, a very early one. But it's the artist's desire to go down into the depths of his own uniqueness and come up with something uniquely his own, what he really wants to express. Inanna's call, if you look at it, it's the side of her that's been neglected. It's the wild, instinctual part of her. Maybe, if you look at her as Inanna as her dark side, needing to be relieved and reborn and touched by something more human, that's what drives Inanna, because as wife, mother, queen, she's been too busy to really get in contact with her deep, wounded, frightened, dark side. So she strips herself free of all the trappings that she's familiar with and goes down to Ereshkigal, who wisdom sends empathy in the form of these instinctual creatures, these galators and these demons, whatever they are, these galas, and that's what makes Inanna able to return whole. So what's being reborn in this model is Ereshkigal's birth labor becomes Inanna with an integrated dark side. Or as Carl Jung said, you have to integrate with your shadow. The part of yourself that you're afraid of, you have to confront that and integrate it into you. It's not your enemy, it's part of you. And then if you notice when you're down there, the servants help her, because Inanna's servant is really powerful and the queen is really weak. So in the underworld, everything's upside down and topsy-turvy. There's what we call a great big mighty inversion down there. And conversely, Inanna's dark side gets nourished in the underworld, and Inanna's rotting corpse nourishes hell. She comes up demonic. Maybe you need the demonic to make you fully, completely nourished. You need something more than what that sanitized Disney world we were just talking about. And as we were talking about, death is what nourishes life. So we've got a 6-month cycle here of lower and underworlds, creating a flow, opening a door. The great above and the great below are intimately linked in a cycle, which it replicates nature, but it could also be viewed psychologically. Now, Dumuzi experiences the same pattern, because as king, he's all happy being king, he's oblivious to Inanna. She actually sees it as good for him from this angle to expose him to what's scary, which is his own dark side. So, maybe from a certain angle, death is the dark side of Dumuzi that he needs to experience, and he has to have his own midlife crisis. He doesn't even miss Inanna when she's gone. It's like when somebody's died, but you don't realize it could really happen to you. So she scares him when she returns from the underworld, all glowing with her new demonic nature. And he's very rational, but he doesn't really understand the irrational, and he doesn't see her as a good influence. So she has to, shake him up. He's not brave, he's not courageous. He has to go to the underworld to get tougher, to really realize his full self. And so that's just another version of the same story that includes him, okay? He has to face all the darkness and complexity of Inanna in order for himself to become bright. So that's a very psychological read. Okay, so this is the descent to the underworld. That's the ritual of descent. This is not my reading of the myth. It's the reading of Mircea Eliade, okay, whom you've already read, who's a, mythologist of sorts. But then there are others, such as Otto Rank, Joseph Campbell, whom we talked about, Lord Raglan. These are older figures. Raglan goes all the way back to the 19th century. Raglan, Rank, Campbell believe that in every life and in every myth that's worth its salt, there are at least 4 steps. And one is, the separation, so you have to separate from your origins. Then there's a call to action. A couple of these steps are the same. There's a call to action. And then the next step is confrontation with a demon, a monster. And then there's integration, getting, resurrected, reintegrated into your community. Integration. So this is particularly, the ritual of descent is particularly about the underworld passage. This is a more general way of interpreting all myths, even if you're not just looking at the underworld part, okay? And the confrontation might include, looking at it this way, if you want to think of it this way, the ritual of descent is in here. But it's part of a bigger cycle, and then, I don't know if this helps, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 would all fit into part of this. somewhere between your confrontation with an enemy and your reintegration of community, you're going to have to die and be reborn. And this whole model could describe Gilgamesh. He separates from his origin, he's called to action, he confronts a monster, he faces death, he comes back reborn in some way and is reincorporated into the community that he left. Kings are not supposed to leave their kingdom. He is dissatisfied with it, goes out. So you see, now I'm not just talking about the underworld here, I'm talking about the whole scope of a hero story. Let's look at Gilgamesh, because it's part of the same culture. The only thing that's going to be different is the names of the gods are going to change from Sumerian names to Babylonian names, right? So, but they're the same gods as we discussed in the last class. So it'd be like if we finished reading the Iliad and started reading the Aeneid. The Iliad is Greek, the Aeneid is Roman. It's the same gods, but different names. What do we know historically about Gilgamesh, by the way? Just to be clear, that this is a real historical figure. When did this guy live? I guess that if you just jump into the myth part, it's not going to tell you that. But I have told you before that it's based on a real king. King Gilgamesh lived somewhere between 28 and 25,000, 2,800 and 2,500 years before Christ. Okay, so long time ago, 6,000 years ago, ish. At least 5,000. So between 5 and 6,000 years ago. Or my math is bad. Let's see, 2,800, but excuse me, 4 and 5,000 years ago. Excuse me, but so long ago you can actually get 1,000 wrong when you're doing your math. But he really was the king of the city-state of Uruk. So Euhemerist likes that because from his angle of reading it, then this is all an historical account that's been distorted. Just a distortion of the story of a great king. But one of the early people to translate this, and understand these tablets were all dug up in the ancient library of Assyria. Now the Assyrians are mentioned in the Bible, which we're going to read next. They are Ashurbanipal, for example, leader of the Assyrians. He conquered the Babylonians. The Babylonians conquered the Akkadians. The Akkadians conquered the Sumerians. This is a realm where I'm dealing with thousands of years of history. I just gave you in 2 seconds, where one people came in and conquered another. So you've got many layers of conquest. And by the time you get to the Assyrians, they've inherited a myth from many cultures before them, and they were all written down in these tablets that were buried and lost for thousands of years. And then someone came along, in the 20th, late 19th, early 20th century, and dug this stuff up. And they found these tablets, and the guy that was actually translating it for the first time came upon a passage. Understand, it took a long time to crack the code. And the language of the ancient Minoans, at least one of them, we still haven't cracked. You understand, the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics we just learned to translate 100 years ago-ish. Nobody for thousands of years knew what they said. This guy was translating, this tablet, and he came upon a story of the flood. And you read that story. What did it remind him of? Go ahead.
Noah's Ark.
It reminded him a lot of Noah's Ark. Only Noah wasn't called Noah, he is called Utnapishtim, but the story was exactly the same with only a few details that were different. He was so amazed that this was in this ancient cuneiform tablet that, when he got to that realization that this was the story of the flood, he thought that this proved that the flood actually happened because, two cultures have the same myth. Now, it's not the way I would interpret it, but it seemed like a really deep discovery to him. So he just stripped his clothes off and ran naked through the house screaming. He was so excited. This is a true story, okay? Just the translator just going, oh my, look what I've discovered. So just from the mere archaeological historical perspective, this is fascinating. This is fascinating because it tells us about the myths that inform our culture, and a lot of people didn't even know that these stories existed. Now they're required in a lot of courses. This stuff is becoming, it's still a little cutting edge, but it's becoming kind of part of the canon, the way people read ancient Greek myth, even though they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, they're still interested in this other stuff. this is entering that canon of the ancient Greek kind of realm, but it's not as well known yet. This is an epic, but what does that mean? I mean, it's different from the stories of Inanna, which are short songs. This is an epic. But what does epic mean? Because I don't think the ancient Sumerians knew they were writing an epic. It's a weird term. When you hear epic, what do you think of? Like that was an epic accomplishment, or that was an epic journey you took.
Grand and important.
Right, grand and important and big, right? It seems that most cultures have like a big story in there somewhere that's really important to them. Like the story of Moses in the Hebrew Bible is the epic part. It seems that's the part that, certain societies keep going back to, right? The part of Sumerian myth that's epic is the Gilgamesh part, not the Inanna part. But we don't know what epic is. In ancient Greeks, what are the epics for the ancient Greeks?
The Odyssey.
The Odyssey and the Iliad. So based on that, because the Odyssey is about a long journey and the Iliad is about a long war, we've assumed in a kind of retrospective way that whatever we're calling epic will have themes that involve war and journey. And they're certainly here in Gilgamesh. But that doesn't mean that the people creating these things knew that these were requirements that they had to include. So it just, people have noticed this cross-culturally. Wherever you go, you find these big stories that have battles in them, or journeys in them, or both. It's a feature of the culture. The Bible and Shakespeare is to us what the Epic of Gilgamesh was to its society, only Gilgamesh was probably more important to them than even the Bible and the Shakespeare is to some modern Americans today. And what is it about? What are other themes of epic? Well, one theme that often comes up is like the finding your limits, like what is the role of your free will, and then what happens if you push yourself to your limits? What are the limits of what it means to be human, and where does the divine begin? Where are your human limits? And then to turn the question toward you, do you believe that it's your role to find your limits? Do you think that that's one of the things you want to find out in life, or that you're going to find out? Either because you want to or because you're not going to be able to help it?
Yeah.
All right, well, Josh says yes. Other people might not feel that ambitious, but can you avoid finding out what your limitations are? What do you say no? What do you think? I mean, you're very young, so it's hard for you to really fully answer. But you might have an inkling. What are you going to say, Ella?
Well, you can avoid finding out your limits, but you don't really get anywhere.
Do you think if life would be more meaningful if you tested your limits in some way?
Yeah.
Have you ever done this in any sphere? Like you want to see how far you could go in like track team, or it could be anything. Some interest you have. How far can I go? You could say like, I'm learning to like do figure drawing, but I'm not that good at it yet. I want to learn how good I could become at it. Do you have things like that? When you're playing a musical instrument, you think, well, maybe I could get really good at this. Could I be so good that this could be my career? Those are questions you might be asking. It's a good time to be asking these questions. What do you want to do with your life? And can you do it? Maybe you don't have to be the best in the world to just do it, but it might be really hard to make a living at it. Is there something you want to do? You can say, oh, well, I want to, go to the Far East and do social work, but I'm not sure that I'm up to it, Could I join the Peace Corps? Whatever your ambition is, it doesn't have to be this. Maybe you want to be like the CEO of a big company, but that's not really a new school type ambition, but maybe you want to be like a successful dancer and you want to actually make a living at it. That's a very tough ambition. Sometimes even the New York City, maybe you want to become a singer, but even the New York City Opera's going out of business because not enough people support it. The arts is a hard place to make a living. Social work can be hard. Maybe you're thinking, oh, I want to be a psychologist or something, or a psychiatrist or a therapist, but could I handle listening to people's problems all day and coping with that? What will I learn about myself that I'm afraid of if I become a psychiatrist? A lot of times people go into a field because they're really curious about themselves. It's not just wanting to help other people, they want to know what they're about, and that's what complicates the whole field of psychology in some ways. Do you think that death plays a role in your life? Because often pushing yourself to your limits is confronting death. Do you feel this plays a role in your life, that you know you've got limited time here?
Yeah.
Does for Josh. Okay, does for Ella, does for the other Josh, for both Joshes. You're all nodding. But you're so, well, but it's odd. There's this cliche that people, when they're not getting old, don't think about death. But then what do we know about death that would kind of fly in the face of this idea that when you're young, you don't think about death?
Well, there's the whole thing with aging. Like, we don't necessarily think, like, oh, I'm going to die in X amount of years, but you think, you know, in 10 years, I'm going to be 30, and, like, that's a big thing, too.
Oh, you mean when you're 30, you won't be able to say the same things about yourself that you could say now? Kind of flies in the face of, like, well, my identity is that I'm a student, because at 30 I might not be able to say that. My identity is that right now I just need to take courses, but I don't really need to do a lot of things I might need to do when I'm 30. I don't know, but, like, maybe that bothers you, or maybe you think you'll look different, and so if you're going to have a different identity, and of course, you know, people have delusions about what these ages mean. Why can't you do the same things that you're doing now at 30? Are there any rules? Couldn't a 50-year-old do what a 19-year-old does? Or do you feel that there's some natural progression or order? Certainly you're interested in these questions, and you know that you age. That's inevitable, right? So you're going to change in terms of your appearance and all kinds of things. Eventually your body will break down when you get past a certain age. But let's go back to just death itself. Is it true that only old people die? At what ages can people die? What do you mean by any age? Do people die when they're 1 year old?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty common actually. I mean, you don't hear about it so much, but there's, you know, all the people that die in hospitals when they're just born or a year later, they get buried, a lot of them, on an island right here in the East River. There was a woman who tried to find her baby from 20 years ago there. There's 1 million people buried there. You know, you don't want to know these things, right? I know people who died at every ages. Okay, now you could say, you know, you're not dead. You know, that didn't happen. I know dead people, and you're not dead. You can't be dead. You were only 25 years old, but you are. I know people who died at your age. I've had students that didn't make it to their senior year. A skiing accident, a sickness. Do you know that the mortality rate is 100%?
Yep.
You're aware of that, and it could hit at any time? Are you really fully aware of that? How many people know someone your age or younger who died? That's everyone in the room. Almost. This is what's very upsetting to everybody. Okay, so you got to deal with this issue. You can't get around it. That's why we have these myths. So myths play a very important cultural role. And there's no one version of them because these issues are always being explored from different angles. This was originally an oral myth. It means it wasn't written down originally. So even though it's many thousands of years old, it lived in a form that wasn't written down for a long time. And even after it was written down, it kept changing. And everybody notice when you're reading this, they're like, but in the alternate version from 1,000 years later, they say this. Have you noticed that? It makes it very hard to read, but it gives you a sense of the vitality of the tradition. How many stories of Cinderella do we have in our culture? Lots, okay? There are old Disney movies as well as new ones, and they're not the same. You know, there are the original Grimm's tales, and they're not like the Disney movies. And there are many other versions. There's the version your friend, your mother, someone else tells that's different. Okay. So Gilgamesh is king and friend to Enkidu eventually, but he's king initially. What are his characteristics initially? What are we told about him? If you were just to go to, say, page 5 early on in this book, or even page 3, you know, you got the page 3 to 4 to 5, those early pages. What are we told about him initially? Yeah, go ahead.
He's 2/3 divine and 1/3 human.
Well, that's a weird thing. What is this 2/3 divine, 1/3 human stuff?
It gives him like a greater power, but he's still mortal.
Oh, you mean he could still die,
Yeah.
but he's got very powerful, You know, he's much stronger than the rest of us. It's like one of those people in those Middle Earth movies, you know? Like, you know, all these muddy, slingy, gross monsters, they're just not nearly as powerful as Viggo Morgenstern. You can kill a whole slew of them. But Viggo Morgenstern could be killed, you know, he could be killed. You just have to hit him with an arrow in the right place or something, you know? So think of it like that if you want. And by the way, those movies played up the monsters much more than the original books did. But anyway, because, yeah, I guess that's a bigger sell. You sell the special effects, that's Hollywood. But he's 1/3 mortal, 2/3 divine. Now, can heroes vary in their levels of divinity? Like I don't know if we just go transculturally here. Are some heroes all divine? Well, yeah, because Inanna is a hero as far as I'm concerned,
Right.
and she's all God. She can even die but can get resurrected. But then so can Jesus, and you could view Jesus as a hero too. The interesting thing about Inanna is she's a female hero, as Demeter is. Okay? Can a hero be all mortal? Can you think of one, like a famous one that's all mortal, no divine parent? Batman. Okay. Well, we'll take it. Okay. If Superman, I don't know, he seemed to have superpowers, but Batman really doesn't. He's just got martial arts skills, right? So,
Well,
no
money,
divine
too.
blood. What's that?
Martial arts skills and money.
Yeah, right. So he's got, you know, things to help him, but he really just like amplifies his human abilities. Well, Odysseus, who we're going to read about, doesn't have any divine parents. He's just human. He's all human. He's just a very strong person. On the other hand, Aeneas, whom the Romans say was on the Trojan side when Odysseus was on the Greek side, his mother is Venus, Aphrodite in Greek system, okay? But his father, Anchises, is mortal, so he's half and half. So we find all versions of heroes, all divine, half divine, not divine at all, but still a hero. So what makes you a hero is much more your CV, it's much more this than it is what your powers are. That we expect you to be physically strong and mentally powerful, like Odysseus, like Oedipus, who's got both of those. Often Superman too. What makes him really a superhero is he wins because of his head. It's not just his, like because he can fly or something. He's smart. That's important. But this 1/3, 2/3 thing's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, how do you work it out genetically? Go ahead,
I
yeah.
have no idea.
I don't either. I've got no idea how that works.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a little strange, right? If you ever come up with an answer to that, though, I'm interested in hearing, because like, no matter how you do the math, you got two parents, and you know you got to divide things up into halves or quarters.
Nope.
How are you going to get a 1/3, 2/3 percentage? But that's what we're told. We're told also that he's a paragon of strength and beauty, that he protects the civilized life of the city. He is a hero who makes civilization possible. He's a king who presides over the city. And he, you know, we're told on page 3, which is the very first page of the very first tablet, that he brought tidings or news back from before the flood. He's the first man to do this, besides the Utnapishtim himself. So he met Utnapishtim. And he took a long journey. He built the walls of Uruk, which no human being will equal. We're told that on page 3, page 4 also. And that he'll be remembered in these tablets. So there's something about him worth remembering. And it soon becomes clear that nevertheless, this is I think on page 4 somewhere there, that he has faults as a king. There's something that even though he's great, he's glorious, he's going to be remembered forever, he's gone to the edges of the earth, he's built the walls of the city, something's wrong with him. I can't have a story without a flaw, okay? What's wrong with this guy, with this king? This gets the whole thing rolling. Go ahead, Salim.
He starts these competitions that the people think are unfair, where he shows his, I guess, physical prowess, and it makes the citizens all very upset, and they start to complain to the gods about it.
What are they complaining about when they say specifically he will leave no son to his father?
Oh, I guess he leads them to many wars, and a lot of the men are dying, and and he's taking all the women, and he's.
Well, that's a second
Oh,
point, but
whoops,
yeah,
sorry.
okay, hold off on that one. All the young men are dying because he loves war. He's always seeking new battles, and of course he can draft the young men to fight these battles, but they're not as strong as him, they end up dying. So he leaves no son to his father, which is a terrible burden on everybody in the city. Like it's like the revolutions of the 1960s when all people your age or a little older than you were dying, and people didn't want their sons dying, and the sons didn't want to die either. Women, I don't think, could be drafted at that time. So the young men of the United States were dying. And that was a cause of great upset. People were challenging the president. Lyndon Johnson, what are you doing? And his successor, Richard Nixon, as well. You know, should you be the president? Look how you're wrecking this country. So they have the same accusation against Gilgamesh. All right, go ahead, yes.
Just to with that point, isn't there a kind of a contradiction when you're describing him as being someone that has kingly virtue,
Yeah.
but yet he's doing these horrible things?
Well, what do you think? Is, like, for example, being a really strong military leader not a virtue that would necessarily have a downside? Like, do you see it as, like, virtue is always separate from pain and suffering, or can virtue actually cause pain and suffering?
Well, I mean, it also says that he's wise in all things, so he should have been wise enough to know that his wars were taking a toll on the people that were unfavorable.
But was he always wise in all things? Remember, the opening, we're told he brought back tidings from the flood. When did he do that?
Or I guess after the fact, yeah.
Okay, so we're told in the opening tablet who he is at the end of the story. And then we go to the beginning and say, here's a king that actually was causing some trouble. So I think that he wasn't wise in all things yet at this point.
Okay.
Making sense?
Makes sense, yeah.
It's hard to read the text because of the way it's organized, but very often you could start with a summary of like what was great about George Washington, and then you go back to his early life and look at all his failures and how he got to be so great. And it's true of George Washington. He did become a very wise, people don't already know, military leader and so forth, but he failed at a lot of early battles. He screwed up royally. And eventually, though, he became a great leader. We put down the Whiskey Rebellion. I don't know if you know about these things, and actually that was whiskey made out of corn. But anyway, I won't even go into it, but he actually learned how to, like, put down a rebellion in the United States at a time when the country was very unstable. There was no guarantee that you would even have a country in the future. And he did it without killing anybody. But he had to bring the whole army in there and threaten everybody. And by the time he got there, they had laid down their arms. But it was many experiences of failure that brought him to the point that he could do that. Lincoln, too, you know, before he became wise and deep, was an unscrupulous lawyer in his youth. So people do change over time, okay? But what's the other problem? Because Salim mentioned something else. There's another issue, also mentioned on page 5.
It's taking over women.
Yeah, so he'd not only leave no son to his father, he'd leave no daughter to her mother. But what does that mean? Taking all the women. Yeah, go ahead.
He's got like first dibs on all of them. Even if they're married, he'll come to the wedding and he'll bless the bride with, you know, his loins first. I
So,
guess.
yeah, you got it exactly right. Okay, may seem really strange to you, but the king had the option of deflowering young brides before their husbands did. Okay, this may seem odd to you, but it was a power that kings had in this culture at the time. But is the king supposed to deflower every single bride who gets married? No, he was pushing it too far. Now there's a little note in there saying he was arrogant or hubristic, but to me, that's an editor jumping in. We've got to interpret this. It seems to me to have been something that was what a king was allowed to do, but he took it too far. Similarly, a king is allowed to start a battle and draft the young men, but he's gone too far. When you go too far, you know it because people are getting upset. So we would get upset if someone did this even once, but apparently this is what kings could do at the time. It seems to have had something to do with the fertility ritual where the king and the temple prostitute would actually enact a sexual union to restore the fertility of the land. But he took this much too far. So he has certain failings as a king, and what do these failings have in common? Yeah, go ahead.
They're all ego-driven, or I guess.
Yeah, but we're also against ego in our modern culture. because we're all so influenced by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But is ego necessarily wrong? Because I don't think ancient cultures have an interdiction or against ego. They don't say that you shouldn't brag. They don't say that humility is the highest virtue. I think that's much post-axial age. Much more axial age is the age of Socrates, the age of Buddha, the age of Jesus. We're going back before that to what we think of as the heroic age of civilization. Go on, yes. So my question is, first of all, I guess two questions. Why are your high school teachers always telling you, and your imams and priests and ministers and rabbis that it's so bad to have a big ego? And do all cultures agree about that? And if so, if they don't, then maybe we need to thrash this out. Yeah, go ahead, yes.
Well, so the two questions that to answer the latter first is the ego is only an issue when it harms yourself or those around you, which I think is an issue here because it's harming his reputation and it's also harming his people in general. And as a king, you should look after your people. And then for the second part that you asked in terms of ego and being humble and modest, I feel that, well, in terms of the teachings of Jesus at least, it's like, how can you go to bed with a full stomach when your neighbor is starving kind of thing. So it's just a sense of community and less of the tribal, nomadic views in terms of, it's just our tribe and our people that we should look after and more of on a global scale or, just in terms of your neighbor and taking care of.
Oh, no, I got what you're saying, but it sounds to me like you're saying selfishness is wrong, but that could be different from ego in my book, I think. Someone could have a very big sense of self-esteem and yet not be selfish. It seems to me possible.
Yes, it could be.
But you're saying, like, you're not taking care of your neighbor, but what if you are? Then what's wrong with your ego? But we still think it's wrong to have an ego, so I'm just exploring that. And when you go back to what you said, you're saying that he's fighting these battles just because he's got a big ego, and that's also why he's deflowering brides. And I'm questioning if that's the only reason, or if it is really the reason why he's doing these things. Go on, yes, Ella?
I don't know, it just seems like a testosterone display.
Okay, yeah, okay, what about
Which could-
testosterone? Explain that.
I mean, like, going back to his origins of the 2/3 God, it seems like he's trying to play up the 2/3 God part and ignore his human side. And, he's trying to be the God even though he's not completely, which tends to anger gods, like in mythology in general.
Well, you notice that we don't criticize gods, at least in the ancient Greek gods, for doing things like whatever they do.
Yeah.
Starting wars, having illicit relationships with human mortals that the human mortals don't have a lot of say in. Zeus is kind of a weird leader to be leading, if you think about some of the stuff he does. But they accept that this is a leader among gods. So it's a complicated question, but I think maybe Ella's angle is one we have to consider. What if he just doesn't have a good control of his appetites? He likes to fight. He's got a very big sex drive. Like, he's not really human. He's like over the top. He's going too far because he doesn't discipline himself. It could be ego, but I think that's a very Christian way of reading it. I think much more likely it's just too much appetite. It's like eating too much. Can be a problem. And you could say that's your ego, or you could say, no, you just don't know when to stop because you like food. I mean, just another way of looking at it is much simpler. But whatever it is, we need to see his faults because these clarify Mesopotamian ideas about kingship, that kings have to have a sense of moderation, that they're not allowed to just indulge excessively in whatever their whims happen to be. And, this is true to this day. We don't believe a good leader should do that stuff. So, right, we could say Lyndon Johnson was out of bounds. We could also say Bill Clinton was out of bounds in another way, right? So, what's the solution that the gods propose to the problem of Gilgamesh once the people start to complain?
Make him an equal. Like, make him like a counterpart.
Okay, good. So Aruru, that's the goddess who created people, creates a counterpart for Gilgamesh. And what's the counterpart's name? Enkidu. Okay, now, I don't know. I heard that this guy's starting to appear in video games now. But Where does he place Enkidu? Where does she place him when she creates him? On the steps. So where are the steps? Steppes.
The jungle and the wild. It's like
Okay,
a
yeah.
Tarzan man.
Okay, yeah. So the steppes are way out. They're not really like jungle, but they're like the open
Plain.
plains with literally are kind of rugged terrain that you'll find, for example, in Russia. And you can find them in the Near East too, of course, because that's where this thing is set. And what does Enkidu look like? Because Salim just started to describe this dude. I think it's on page 6 we get a full description of him. What does he look like and what does he do? Is it just Salim? Nobody remembers that Enkidu was kind of different from us? Go on, yes.
Well, he was like larger than most people, but he was a little shorter than Gilgamesh.
Yes.
Like had the same like build, I guess. Like,
Yes.
he was stronger or something. He had hair all over his body too.
He's very hairy. He's very large.
And had really long hair like a woman.
And he's got long hair like a woman. His locks grew thick as a grain field, we're told. He dressed as animals do. He fed on grass with gazelles. How many of you can eat grass?
I take shots of wheatgrass sometimes.
Well, yeah, but what happens if you fill your mouth with the grass and try to chew that stuff?
Can't do it.
You can't digest it, too much cellulose, but cows can live on it. So can a lot of animals, but your stomachs, you just don't have enough stomachs. Cows do. They've got enough chambers. Like, we just don't have it. We can't chew our cud, okay? With beasts, he jostled at the water hole. With wildlife, do you ever get like in there next to the deer and the gazelles and the hippos and just kind of bump up against them and stick your head in the water hole?
Generally not.
Generally not. Okay, so he's living like
No.
an animal, right? So he's primitive man, but he's more animal than human. And what's the effect of these powers that he's given? Because he's different from the animals too. We learn on page 7, for instance. What's some of the stuff he starts doing?
He started hunting his own, like, brethren, I guess.
Not yet. Does he kill other animals? Where are we told that?
No, that's like his family at that point.
Not yet, because they're his peeps.
Yeah,
But I
just
can't use the word peeps because they're animals. But he's not going to kill them. Because they're his brethren, okay, to use a very Christian term. They're his, they're his neighbors, they're his friends. But what does he do that's sort of upsetting to people? Go ahead, Salim.
He starts sabotaging the traps that the hunters lay out. Like if they dig ditches, he'll dig them in so that they can't trap the animals. And the hunter gets very upset about it. And
Yeah, look at line 130. He has filled in the pits I dug. He has torn out my traps I set. He has helped the beasts, wildlife of the steppes, slip from my hands. So the people who are trapping and hunting animals, what upsets them? That Enkidu, yeah, go ahead.
He's basically just not giving them what they want.
Well, you're out there trying to hunt and he's getting in the way and he's helping all the animals escape from the pits you're digging and the traps you're setting. So the people complain to Gilgamesh, because he's the king.
well, he complains to his father.
Then he
first.
complains to his father, yeah, okay. Well, first of all, if you think about it, then what did Gilgamesh and Enkidu have in common?
They're both kind of stepping out of bounds.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing for an animal to drink from the water hole, it's another for it to free all the other animals from traps. It's one thing for a king to want to start wars, it's another for him to, kill off all the young men in these wars. So they're both taking their own realms too far. But then, you'd expect that because Enkidu is like another Gilgamesh. Why wouldn't he, within his own realm, commit the same excesses if he's going to be the equal of the one he was created to oppose? So they're destabilizing the order that human beings want in both cases. And what is Gilgamesh's solution to the problem of Enkidu? And this is sort of surprising to a lot of people.
To bring in Shamhat.
Shamhat, yes. We're told on 7 and 8 that Shamhat is what he supposes will be the solution, or whom he supposes will be the solution. And who is Shamhat?
A harlot.
She's a harlot. She's a temple prostitute. Word prostitute to modern people suggests a streetwalker. She's not that. She's a woman who has ritual sex. First of all, how is submitting Enkidu to the enticements of a harlot going to affect him?
It's supposed to civilize him, I guess.
Yeah, did anyone find that surprising?
Well, I thought. Sorry.
Oh.
Go.
Yeah, go ahead, Ella. Yeah.
Yeah, because like, especially reading it side by side with Inanna, and like in Inanna, sex was so much about like there's all these links to nature and agriculture, and then here it's like sex is related to traditions and like kind of civilization, culture, like fineries, that sort of thing.
Okay, so you're saying that it's strange for you in some ways to see sexuality linked to culture. But when you said nature and agriculture, are those really the same things? You're saying Inanna's sexuality is linked to nature and agriculture. Is agriculture the same thing as nature?
No. but it
What's
comes
the
from-
main difference?
Well, agriculture is nature civilized.
It's actually civilizing nature to have agriculture. You're not just eating stuff that's growing wherever it is. You're planting it in an organized way. You're breeding the crops. You know, corn is one of those crops that can't exist on its own. It's actually the only one, but you need human beings to plant it or it'll all die out. And you need human beings to pull the seeds off the cob or all the cobs will die. So we have so intervened in nature that we've altered it where in case like that it can't even exist on its own. And that's very unnatural. So we think of this as natural, it's food. But it's only growing the way it's growing and where it's growing because we've civilized it. And so Inanna, though, but you're right, Inanna's sexuality is also associated with a kind of chaos of warfare and so forth, right? But then Enkidu doesn't lose the power to have wars either, to fight. But he does get changed by his, the word intercourse can be used very widely, but I guess I mean it literally here. By his intercourse with Shamhat, he is altered. After all, what happens after his, sleeping with Shamhat?
The animals disown him.
Yeah, they don't want to be around him anymore. They don't consider him one of their own. Animals can just smell that you don't belong. If you have a cat and you go to your neighbor's house, the other cats might just sense that you have cat smell on you, and they may either like you or dislike you because of that. But in this case, they don't want to be around him anymore after that. And what else changes? What else happens to Enkidu now?
He's mortal.
He's always been mortal, but he seems weaker, right? This is all on page 10, by the way. Page 9, page 10, page 14 also. Anything else change about him? It's like 9 all the way up to 14. We're given a lot on this. Yeah, go ahead, yes?
He completely depletes himself of all his strength and energy by his intercourse with Shamhat, and then when he tries to go back to the animals, not only do they run away from him, but he's not strong enough to follow them. And he also finds Shamhat to be a friend now, a friend like.
Okay, so he's totally changed camps here, and even his nature has changed. And she gives him clothing, and as Ella says, music and culture. So now he's much more like a human being. But there's some benefit. What does he gain from all this? And he's physically weaker, but what has he gained? We're told on page 10 that he's gained wisdom, page 9, page 10. That's interesting. Does this remind you of anything where you get all civilized and you also gain wisdom?
Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden, right? When you eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you certainly are weakened because you're out of your pre-Edenic state, and it's almost like a sexual act. It's a violation of some kind, but you gain knowledge, and you now have to have agriculture because you're going to be kicked out of the garden and you have to plant your own crops. So it's very strange that these texts could intersect, as Ella is observing there, even though they're coming out of different traditions. And what specifically does she teach him, in addition to clothing, music, and culture? Like when it comes to food, because we were talking about agriculture. Like what foods does she give him, teach him how to eat?
Bread.
Bread and?
Beer.
Why bread and beer instead of, for example, meat and water?
It's of their culture.
Well, why are bread and beer associated with culture, whereas meat and water don't have to be associated with culture?
Because you don't make them, you just get them wild.
Yes, you can find meat and water just the way it is. Is there any animal besides human beings that can make bread? Any animal behind human beings that can make beer? Well, how are those crops different? When you take hops and you make and malt and you make it into beer, what do you have to do?
You have to.
Yeah, go ahead,
I was just
Taylor?
gonna say fermentation.
You have to ferment it. It's a whole, you gotta set up a laboratory, basically. You know that beer is a food? You all aware of this? You know, Calvin used to have it for breakfast. I mean, it's a breakfast food for certain cultures. You may laugh and see this is silly, but it actually has a lot of calories in it. You know, the term beer belly is actually a misnomer too. It won't give you a beer belly. The beer belly is probably caused by other things people are eating. But you can live on beer. I'm not saying it's really nutritious, but there was a point where, you know, sugar became a popular food and people started using it when it was mass produced. People started drinking like tea in the morning with sugar in it instead of beer, and then their health declined because beer actually provided real nutrition. Now we just think of it as like something you get in a bar to get drunk, but it was not viewed that way for most of human culture. So I'm just letting you know that it had a different role here. Bread, similarly, you've got to mill the grain, you got to grow it a certain way, you got to mill it, you got to bake it. No animal can do that, okay? I don't know any like, you know, puppy dog that can make bread. You know, but it knows how to, you know, a cat can kill a bird and eat it. It can get meat, but it can't make bread. Even an intelligent animal doesn't quite know how to do that. So these make him like us. And she also oils him, right? Gives him a complete hair removal job, right? The complete spa treatment. The Brazilian bikini wax, I don't know if it goes that far, but, you know, she does give him a depilatory hair removal treatment. You know that word, depilation, to remove hair? I don't know if that's in the text, it's very Latinic. That's almost a digression. She gets his hair taken off. Okay? And then he has a dream on pages 10 and 11. And what is that dream all about? He dreams what? He dreams that he's going to have a fight with.
Gilgamesh.
And what's going to happen at the end of that fight?
He's gonna love him.
He's going to love this guy, that it's going to have a compassionating effect on him. And then Enkidu comes to Uruk, which shows you something about the nature of the way dreams were understood in the ancient world. Is what is going to happen. Exactly that, okay? So Enkidu comes to Uruk and challenges Gilgamesh to determine who's stronger, okay? And we're told on page 15 that like Enkidu is a little more endomorphic. He's shorter and stockier, whereas Gilgamesh is taller and thinner, which would be ectomorphic. They have different body types, so they're complementary. And Enkidu confronts Gilgamesh at his father-in-law's house. Remember, Gilgamesh is always getting involved in the deflowering of brides on page 16, and prevents him from joining a new bride that night. He says, you're not allowed to go in there. And he blocks the way. And so they start to, Gilgamesh grabs him and they start to fight. And when they fight, what is that fight like?
Clash of the Titans.
Right, so tremors run through the city. It's like an earthquake, okay? Now, why is it such a big fight? These are obvious questions. The text doesn't tell you, but they seem obvious to me. Why is this a fight that's like an earthquake? Yeah.
Because no one's ever challenged Gilgamesh like that before.
No, and Gilgamesh
no
is
equal.
the most powerful person. He's 2/3 divine. No one's ever equaled him before, and now he's met his match, and so that's going to be one big ruckus, okay? A lot of brouhaha in a battle of two people here, okay? So, eventually who wins? And it's very unclear in the text here. It's like on pages 17 and 18. It's very hard to decipher this. Who wins in this?
Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh wins. So do we have a sense of why? Because we're told that they battle, and then the next moment, like, there are pieces of the text missing, and then Enkidu is crying.
Yeah,
It's
really fragmented.
Yeah, very fragmented. So we're missing part of the story.
I guess he pins him on his back in a way that he's restrained and he can't move.
Right. So given that one line, which you remember really well, what might that tell you about how Gilgamesh defeats Enkidu?
Kind of tapped him out, I guess, in a way.
Well, when you pin somebody on their back so they can't move, what does that require that you apply? Pressure, but let me just put it this way. If you're going to wrestle somebody, what do you need to win a wrestling match? You need at least two very different things, it seems to me.
Submission?
To win?
Yeah, the person you're fighting has to submit, no?
Well, what if the person's not going to submit? What if the will is not an issue here? I mean, a person could give up, but
You need strength.
you need strength, but you also need something else, because they have equal strength.
Leverage.
What can give one the edge over the other if they're equally strong?
Wit,
Skill?
technique.
What about skill and technique? You'll realize that skill and technique are really important, that if you study martial arts, you study judo, you could throw somebody twice your size over your shoulders. You aware of this? Because when I was studying judo as a kid, my judo teacher showed me that even though he was a grown man, I could throw him over my shoulder. Because you're really learning a technique, and when I wrestled in high school, there were all sorts of techniques. You can take down somebody bigger than you, if you know what you're doing. So it's possible that it's not evidence that Enkidu is weaker than Gilgamesh, only that Gilgamesh is more experienced, more civilized. He knows how to do the full Nelson.
He's been
Which,
fighting
by the way,
for a
is an
long time.
illegal wrestling move. But, he knows how to pin the guy down. Right? Okay, so, interesting if you compare it to, for example, the Odyssey, where there's a wrestling match between Odysseus and the second greatest hero, which is Aias. In Latin, his name is Ajax. There's a cleanser named after him, Ajax cleanser. That means it's really strong stuff, okay? Odysseus defeats Ulysses in Latin, defeats Ajax. Odysseus defeats Aias. And really he shouldn't be able to, because Aias is a much stronger guy. But Odysseus knows how to trip him. And Odysseus is much more about, he's this very strong guy, but he's much more about his cleverness. Remember, he wins the whole Trojan War because he divines this trick of the horse. No one could win it fair and square. He figures out a way to get into the city by deceiving the Trojans. I'll give you a side thing and that because of this very trickery, later, there's this, when Achilles dies, there's this whole competition to see who will get the armor of Achilles, which will be the most honored warrior. And everyone thinks it's going to go to the second strongest warrior, Ajax, but it ends up going to Odysseus. And we're not sure how, but the suggestion is that cleverness won out over strength here. And Ajax, is so shamed by this. He's so upset that he commits suicide and kills his own family, and all his sheep, too. He just goes berserk. And then Odysseus later, we're going to read about this, encounters him in the underworld, and Ajax sees this opportunity to make peace with this guy, because he says to him, look, I didn't know that was going to happen. I wish I never saw that armor. I wish, that I had never, ever even laid eyes on it. You were the one who deserved to win, and I'm not going to tell you how that ends. But he talks to him in the underworld and tries to reconcile. He makes this effort. You'll get there. It's book 11 of the Odyssey. We got to get through this epic first. Okay? So somehow Gilgamesh wins. And then what's the outcome of that?
They kissed and became friends.
Well, why would you become friends when you just had a big fight?
Because they're both amazed by each other's strength. They finally met their equal. I mean,
There's stories like this. Even the Trojans and the Greeks, like Diomedes and Glaucon in the Iliad, make friends. They battle each other and then they decide to make friends.
There's like a mutual respect.
Do you think that you have more respect for someone you've done battle with?
Yeah, some cases.
You like this idea of friendship as someone who can match you in some way? Like maybe a tennis player who's as good as you is more likely to be your friend than someone who thrashes you, or someone who's easy to beat? So should your friend be your equal? I mean, what's your thing? Is it your other half? Someone with the same intelligence and skills and talents as you? What's your idea of friendship?
Well, this is also practical. You know, like if Gilgamesh makes friends with him, then he can't be overthrown by him.
Okay, so
Keep your friends.
keep your friends
Yeah.
close and your enemies closer?
Yeah.
Could be. After all, it makes sense that, you know, the friend would be equal because in this case that Enkidu was created to be another Gilgamesh. So they were made for each other literally. But they weren't made to be friends. I mean, this is a surprise to the gods, right? And there's a lot they have in common. You've noticed that, right? They both cause trouble and they need to be tamed. We just talked about that. They both communicate in dreams. Just as Enkidu had a dream about Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh had a dream about Enkidu, and Gilgamesh will have a dream about the future. They're both equally strong and adventuresome. They have all this in common, and so in that sense, they're ideal companions for each other. They're mirror images, but are they exactly the same?
No.
What are some differences? Because we also talked about that.
Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine.
So Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine. We don't know what Enkidu is, but he was created by the gods also. So it's a harder comparison to do. We don't know what his makeup is, but Gilgamesh is the guy that runs the city, right? But he's a little too wild, and Enkidu is the wild man. But what's different about him from other animals?
He's too civilized.
He's a little more civilized. So they're also kind of mirror images of each other in a way that makes them a little bit opposite. You know, a mirror image means the reversed image of your face. When you're looking in the mirror, you're not looking at yourself. You're looking at your face turned backwards, and that the right side of your face is not the same as the left side. If you were to take the right side of your face and double it and make your face two right sides, you would look so scary people would avoid you. If you had perfect symmetry in your face, you wouldn't look human. There's a famous movie called Persona by Ingmar Bergman where he does this with this famous Swedish actress, Liv Ullmann. He puts an image of her face where he perfectly duplicated one side on the other, and she looks so freaky, okay? Why am I pointing this out? In order to really click together, the two sides of your face have to be different. And maybe friends, in order to be really friends, also have to be compatible but also different. Do you think that's true too?
Yeah.
If your friend were too much like you couldn't be friends? Like maybe if one of you is really responsible, you need someone who's a little less responsible, and the less responsible person needs someone who's a little bit more disciplined? Yeah. Do you find that? Do you have a friend that's either more strict or more goofy than you are, and you like that aspect, that it's balancing you out? Or your friend's more adventuresome and you're a little bit more conservative, or you're more adventuresome and your friend is a little bit more conservative, but that balances things out? You kind of get more out of the world that way? Or maybe even if you don't have a friend like that, you would like one. You can, you're not good at computers, but you're good at art, but your friend is good at computers and not good at art. Something like that, some way in which you can help each other. Right? So it seems to be like a good model of friendship. You get in these stories, we get really deep meanings, even though it's like seems like this really weird out there thing. If you apply it to your life, you get a lot that's applicable in an everyday way. And then what do they decide they're going to do now?
Gonna go adventuring.
They're going to go on an adventure together. Is this what friends do?
Yeah.
You like, all right, friend, let's skip class and, I don't know, go to Florida or something? Do you do these things?
Yeah.
We're going to go to movies. Let's go to 3 movies today. Let's go out and do something crazy. Let's go all the way east into the East Village and go as Avenue D. That used to actually be dangerous. I used to go there with my friends when I was, your age-ish, and we thought it was really like so cool that we were going past Avenue B toward Avenue C. Because you didn't know you could get killed, or you don't know, it's like, I'm generalizing, but now it just seems stupid. I mean, well, big deal, Avenue D, whatever. But at the time, it felt like you were crossing like to an area where whatever people said it was dangerous, or it was a little weird. People would throw bottles at you randomly. There were a lot of like drunk people. I don't know. Sometimes they would start fires in the park. I don't know, but whatever.
Yeah.
What's that?
Nothing, I was giving a quip, ignore my quip.
Oh, right. Did I say something really stupid or silly? Okay, because I could have. I mean, I don't even know what I'm saying. You might decide you're just gonna like go swimming in the East River, and that could be kind of weird because you don't know what's floating around in there. But of course, they're gonna do something more than that, aren't they? What do they decide to do?
Go in the forest.
And what are they gonna fight in the forest?
Monsters.
What's the monster's name?
Humbaba?
Humbaba. Actually, there's a big scholarly debate. Is he Humbaba or Huwaba? But whatever he is, Humbaba or Huwaba, do you just go out there and fight Humbaba?
No. Dude's
You don't mess with Humbaba. You don't mess with Humbaba because Humbaba, what are we told about him? And then I'll let you go if you get a sense of just how scary Humbaba is, because I don't know if you have quite internalized this.
It's like all the natural disasters.
What's that?
It's all the natural disasters.
He's all the force of nature, like all natural power, like he's like Enkidu on steroids. We're told about at the bottom that his roar is a deluge, like a flood. His maw is fire, his breath is death. His face looks like coiled intestines. Do you want to mess with Humbaba? Are you like kidding me? This elemental natural force who's like fire, flood, and death? What the heck are you talking about? And why does he want to do this? He's like, well, you know, we don't live forever. You got to do this stuff with your life while you're here. And I'll be really famous for taking on, like, you know, the ultimate, like, dude you don't mess with. And, you know, he's a threat besides. And by the way, if we can encounter him when he's not wearing all his glories, maybe we could take him down. If all the gods help him, which they do. They get all this help. They only defeat him with the help of the winds. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but this part of the epic goes on too long. But we're going to get through it really quickly tomorrow and then move on to the key question of what happens after. Because, you know, after they defeat the forest, and we'll come back to this in the next class, okay? As you remember, Ishtar sort of that's Inanna, takes a liking to Gilgamesh after that. She's like, you know, dude looks good to her after this, okay? And he turns down her advances, and then that leads to the point where things kind of spiral out of control. Because the confrontation with Humbaba seems like the confrontation with death, but it's not the deepest confrontation. Where is that? The confrontation with Humbaba?
the bull. Or no, wait, what?
The confrontation with Humbaba, is that the separating from your homeland? No, we're past that already. Is that the call to action?
No.
Well, confrontation with Humbaba might be call to action. I'm going to go out and fight the monster, okay? And that's the confrontation. But is that the ritual of descent is a deeper confrontation with death. It's one thing to risk your life to fight a monster. It's another to say, wait a minute, I'm going to die and I can't cope with that. Is there some way you can give me immortality? That's a very different question. Okay? Let me go speak to the underworld. All right, so I'll see you in the next class. We're going to finish the Epic of Gilgamesh and move on to Genesis. So bring both to the next class. Okay? All right, so I moved fast today, but I'm trying to catch up, and we'll see if we can do that.
Yeah, but I dislocated my shoulder.
So in here, I know that was hard, right? You're like, what?
It was interesting.
All right, good.
Thank you for
So
letting me.
come over here, because I got to learn and find out where you've
Thank you
been.
for letting me.
I was. Can I go 3 minutes over? I try not to do that. Hey, what's up?